We are diving in deep on clarity today. It is going to be a good one. And joining me now is Miller Whitehouse coming in from the Solana Policy Institute. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
All right, so it's a busy day here at the Solana Accelerate event. And you wouldn't know it, but there's some things happening in DC right now.
There are a lot of things happening in DC, and
So let's break it down.
Sure.
All right, so clarity, the new markup language, or I should say the new language going to markup. We did a breakdown on this yesterday, Miller, and looks pretty promising. There's some opportunities here. What have you guys noticed in what we've seen come out of these two industries so far?
Well, I think there's been a lot of positive developments since the early January speed bump. I think the yield rewards issue, which you've covered extensively and has been getting a lot of love, has been positively resolved. I think the core pieces of the bill that are most important to crypto, developer protections, clearly defining which agency has authority over you, remains at the center of the bill. So I think it's a bit at hour by hour, but I just interviewed Senator Bernie Moreno, who's a big crypto advocate, and he said that it's going to markup next Wednesday. So fingers crossed that is true, and we could get it to the floor in June and hopefully enacted before August.
So Miller, for a lot of our viewers and listeners, they may not necessarily understand the cycle in which DC works. We're moving toward the summer break.
Yep.
So it's very critical that this starts to get its legs through the Senate right now.
Yep.
Next week on markup, what would be the next step after that?
Okay, so after it goes through committee, and a markup is essentially when senators amend proposed legislation at the committee stage. This bill will be amended by the Senate Banking Committee, which has jurisdiction over these issues. So that's about 20 senators, and they'll vote on whether to pass out the legislation as they amend it in markup to the full Senate. So once it goes from the Senate Banking Committee, they can positively refer it to the full Senate, and then all 100 senators will be able to vote on it and get it done, hopefully.
With that being the case, under markup right now, because even this morning I see a little bit of activity on social talking about that the banks are trying to maybe finagle in another move. Tom Tillis is coming in saying, no, we've got this in play. So is there any other risk that we'd have to worry prior to markup between now and next Wednesday?
It pays to be paranoid in this town, or at least the town of Washington. So certainly, yes. Who knows? Anything in the world could happen. And if it affects national politics, it now affects the prospects of the bill. That's just the nature of legislating. I think that's actually a good sign that we're kind of at the whims of national politics, because it means it's real. So I think never say never. There will be new text released 5 days prior to the markup. So I think perhaps at the end of this week, that'll deserve a close read to see what other provisions may or may not have changed.
Do you anticipate from the Senate Banking Committee, because we have some advocates in there and some not so many advocates, do you anticipate some hard lines that they may put into this bill, including ethics, other scenarios that we've talked about before?
I think ethics will be the very last issue resolved, and it won't be resolved prior to markup next week. My expectation is that the Senate Banking Committee will pass it out next week, and most of the issues will be addressed, if not all of them, other than ethics. I think from there, it comes down to the White House and Senate Dems making a deal that both can live with to make the bill viable.
Does that get done behind closed doors?
Yes, for sure.
Interesting. All right.
That'll be, Office of Legal Counsel at the White House and Senate Democrats.
Once we come out of the Senate, I guess the House just puts pretty much a rubber stamp on it. Is that kind of the
well, I think, luckily the original product that the Senate is working on came out of the House. They passed it in July last year, the Clarity Act, and the Senate has been working off their product. It's also, I think, been very encouraging. The Senate's been very communicative with the House, and House members that were leaders or are leaders on this bill, like Chairman Hill and Representative Warren Davidson. So I think the Senate has done a good job of making sure that the changes they've made to the House's product are supported by the House. such that whatever comes out of the Senate will in and of itself be a consensus product that the House is comfortable moving to the president's desk.
Miller, is there anything in there right now that you guys feel get into the privacy issue of self-custody or into DeFi protections for where we've been going? Because it's, this is the first time we've really seen any language coming out of these two working groups. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if the bill were enacted today on both self-custody issues and developer protection issues, this bill would be a massive improvement over current law.
For sure.
There is explicit protection for the right to self-custody in the bill, and there's explicit protection for developers from money transmission being misclassified as money transmitters in the bill, which is the charge that Roman Storm was convicted of and keeps everyone up at night. So those two things alone, in my view, make the bill extremely attractive because there's such fundamental issues. Developers need to have the certainty that they're not going to jail for building these things, and people need to know that they have the right to self-custody their own assets. Neither of those things, are explicitly in law today, so it would be a huge improvement to have those.
For sure. Listen, that would be, to me, a big win.
Oh, huge.
If anything, it would be almost worth it just to deal with that. Let's talk about the SEC and some of their exemptive orders, how this is going to work, what Paul Atkins is trying to do in structuring this new SEC to really accommodate much of what we're seeing here at Accelerate, which is a lot of new developers, a lot of new projects being launched. What do you guys see now with what the SEC's plan and trajectory is around this?
I think we've been having really a once-in-a-lifetime moment with the SEC, with Chairman Atkins and Hester Peirce leading the crypto effort. They are true believers in crypto, and it's very rare to have folks so in principle and ideologically aligned with what we're trying to do. So everything they're doing is complementary to what Congress is doing. So for example, they're working on an innovation exemption for on-chain securities trading. The legislation that may pass would direct the SEC to do that kind of innovation exemption. So I think what the SEC is currently doing is they're looking at what Congress wants the agency to do under clarity. They're using the time that it's taken to get the bill done to get ahead of that. And as soon as it's done, I think there will be a mass, a deluge of action out of the SEC once they have clear signal from Congress.
Yeah, I think this is going to open up the lanes in which a lot of people have talked about here in the United States is the almost suppression of development, the suppression of innovation, especially around blockchain. And I'm not talking just about the financial markets. We're talking about all the innovations that blockchain in general are going to have. So I agree with you. Is there anything that we could run in terms of risk? Okay, let's put this past Trump's presidency in 2 years. We've got an SEC that's still favorable. We've got a Fed chair that might be favorable. And you've got two new major regulatory humps done. What do I need to be worried about?
It's an excellent question because I think, one of the most attractive things to me about getting legislation done is that it'll be nothing that you'll have to stay up worried about at night. And I think without legislative certainty, without getting these things into statute for self-custody and developer protections, we should be very worried about, January 2029 to the extent, we have President Gary Gensler or something like that. So I think, a big part about legislation is narrowing the range that the policy pendulum can swing, instead of going from, Gary all the way here to the Trump admin all the way over here. It'll be like this. And that certainty is good for developers, good for businesses, good for investment. And ideally, there will be, of course, within that tightened range, policy debates. There's a ton of rulemakings that'll need to be done pursuant to the Clarity Act. But the range of outcomes will be significantly limited by statutory guardrails.
What do you make of the language that we saw yesterday and the day before coming out? And it really dictated that the Secretary of Treasury might have like a final, alignment on some of the policy making around this. Is this a normal process that you've?
Extremely normal.
Really?
Yes.
So how does that work?
So Congress, I think of legislation as being, if you think about policy and regulation as being like an essay. The statute, meaning the law, sets the outline and gives the topics that the policy is going to cover and all of that. All of the nitty-gritty details, they direct the federal agencies to figure out.
I see.
So in Clarity, there are over 70 rulemakings that Congress will be directing the federal agencies to do. And within the guardrails that the statute sets, there will be wiggle room for the Treasury Secretary, for the SEC, for the CFTC, today's and future agencies to work within that statutory bounds.
Is that a complementary approach from a SEC that was led by Gensler that translates over to one led by Paul Atkins, or does each SEC new administration kind of reconstruct how some of this policy is written out?
Yep. So it's very difficult. Well, certainly there's nothing as difficult as getting a bill done, as we've learned over the last 8 years. But those 70 rules will need to be implemented via a 2+ year procedure that requires notice and comment. Everyone interested in the public or industry gets to put in their thoughts. There are multiple rounds of that. If the agency implements it and you think it's outside of their authority or something like that, you can sue, which the industry did with Gary Gensler several times. Yeah. To undo those rules requires that same process. So it's the process and the input it takes, the resources it takes to get them done, has to be expended to get them undone. So usually there's not a ton of back and forth between rules, between administrations.
Public versus private blockchains. Big battle going on in the industry right now. We've seen emerge. When you look at that and maybe how this innovation is going to be going to the next level, what are your thoughts there at the Policy Institute of public versus private?
Well, I'm sure you could guess where we are on that spectrum, but I think the US has largely, and certainly the Clarity Act has largely settled on public blockchains being the innovation here. I think there's a general consensus in DC that private blockchains are very similar to the traditional financial system and don't represent something fundamentally innovative that warrants a new legal regime. I don't think the rest of the world has come to that conclusion whatsoever. For example, in the UK, the central bank there is talking about their stablecoin regulatory framework that they may implement, and they're definitely considering limiting it to private blockchains because private blockchain replicates a system that they're used to regulating and know and love. So I think that I don't have anything against private blockchains. I think they can operate and should operate as traditional financial institutions do. And my hope is that if we get the Clarity Act done, the rest of the world will come along with us.
Yeah, they'll come. Miller, thanks for coming in today.
Thanks for having
me. Appreciate it. All right.
Appreciate it.
Okay, you guys know what to do. Make sure. And like and subscribe. If you haven't done that already, we'll be covering more from Accelerate. Stay tuned. If you like this video, hit like and subscribe, drop a comment down below, and also join our free private member group. The link is in the description.